Sarah Martinez had always trusted her equipment with her life. As a professional skydiving instructor with over 15 years of experience, she knew every thread, every buckle, and every fold of her parachute like a mother knows her child's face. That Tuesday morning in October felt different, though. The air was crisp and clear over the Nevada desert, perfect conditions for what was supposed to be a routine training jump with 3 new recruits. She arrived at Desert Wind Skydiving Center earlier than usual, wanting to double-check everything before the students arrived. The facility had been her second home for the past 5 years, ever since she'd moved from Chicago to start fresh after her divorce. The owner, Marcus Webb, had given her a chance when other places wouldn't hire a woman as head instructor. She'd proven herself by reducing accident rates to 0 and building the center's reputation across 3 states. But lately things had felt off. Small things at first. Her locker had been left slightly open twice in the past month. Her equipment bag had been moved from where she'd left it. When she'd mentioned it to Marcus, he'd brushed it off as forgetfulness, or maybe one of the part-time staff cleaning around her gear. Sarah wasn't convinced. Her military training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct screamed that someone was watching her. The previous week, she'd discovered something that made her blood run cold. While conducting her monthly inventory of emergency equipment, she'd found discrepancies in the logbooks. Parachutes that should have been retired were still in rotation. Safety checks that she'd never signed off on bore her forged signature. When she'd confronted the equipment manager, Tony Reeves, he'd gotten defensive and claimed computer errors were common with their old system. Sarah had started conducting her own secret inspections, staying late to examine gear that other instructors would use the next day. What she'd found was systematic sabotage, subtle cuts in non-critical straps that would weaken over time, repack jobs that looked perfect on the surface but had been deliberately compromised. Someone was trying to cause accidents, and they were doing it in a way that would look like equipment failure or human error. The night before this jump, she'd finally gathered enough evidence to prove her suspicions. Hidden in her apartment was a folder containing photographs, measurements, and detailed notes about every piece of compromised equipment she'd found. She'd planned to call the Federal Aviation Administration after this morning's training session. She had no idea that someone had been watching her investigate, tracking her every move. As she performed her pre-jump inspection that Tuesday morning, Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency over her main chute, her reserve, and all the connecting hardware. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. The packing job was flawless, the fabric pristine, the lines properly secured. But something nagged at her. The pack felt different in her hands, maybe a pound heavier than usual. Her fingers traced the deployment bag, searching for anything out of place. The rubber bands felt correct, the closing pin was properly seated, and the pilot chute was packed according to regulations. Yet her gut told her something was wrong. She considered switching to a backup rig, but the students were already arriving, and she didn't want to delay their first jump experience over what might just be paranoia. Tony Reeves appeared beside her as she was strapping on her gear. His usual cocky smile seemed forced today, and he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. He made small talk about the weather and the students, but his hands were shaking slightly as he helped her adjust her chest strap. When she asked him directly if everything was okay, he mumbled something about too much coffee and walked away quickly. The students were excited and nervous, chattering about their first tandem jumps as they suited up. Sarah focused on their safety briefings, running through emergency procedures and hand signals with the calm professionalism that had made her reputation. But in the back of her mind, doubt continued to grow. She made a last-minute decision that would save her life. Instead of using her regular main parachute for the demonstration jump, she quietly switched to her personal emergency rig that she kept locked in her car. It was an older model, but one that only she had access to. If someone was targeting her specifically, they wouldn't have been able to tamper with equipment they couldn't reach. As the plane climbed to altitude, Sarah's unease grew stronger. Through the small window, she could see a strange vehicle parked at the edge of the drop zone property, too far away to make out details but close enough to watch the landing area. The pilot, Jake Morrison, seemed more nervous than usual, constantly checking his instruments and avoiding eye contact when she asked about the wind conditions at altitude. At 12,000 feet, Sarah made another life-saving decision. Instead of jumping over their planned landing zone near the center, she decided to exit the plane early over a section of desert that would take her away from the facility. She told the students it was due to wind conditions, but really she wanted to test her theory about being watched. As she leaped from the plane with her student strapped to her chest, Sarah felt a moment of pure freedom before the paranoia returned. Below her, the Nevada landscape stretched endlessly, beautiful and harsh. She pulled her ripcord at the standard altitude and felt the familiar jerk as her backup parachute deployed perfectly. But her relief was short-lived. As she guided them toward an empty stretch of desert, she spotted movement on the ground below. 2 vehicles were racing across the sand, heading directly for where she would land. These weren't rescue vehicles from the skydiving center. They were military-style trucks, and they were moving with purpose. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she'd stumbled into something much bigger than equipment sabotage at a small skydiving school. Someone had wanted her to die in what would look like an accident, and when that had failed, they were moving to Plan B. As the ground rushed up to meet her, she made rapid calculations about wind speed and distance, trying to land as far as possible from the approaching vehicles. Her mind raced through everything she'd discovered over the past months, connecting dots she'd missed before. The forged signatures, the compromised equipment, Tony's nervous behavior, even Marcus's dismissive attitude when she'd raised safety concerns. Desert Wind Skydiving Center wasn't just covering up accidents. It was part of something larger, and she'd gotten too close to the truth. Sarah hit the desert ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact while protecting her student, a young college kid named Danny, who was too terrified to realize they'd just landed in the middle of a deadly game. She quickly unhooked his harness and helped him to his feet, scanning the horizon for the approaching vehicles. They had maybe 3 minutes before the trucks reached their position. Danny was shaking from adrenaline and fear, asking why they'd landed so far from the drop zone, and whether this was normal. Sarah forced herself to stay calm as she gathered her parachute, knowing that panic would get them both killed. She told him there had been a wind shift and that someone would come get them soon, all while her mind raced through escape options. The sound of engines grew louder across the desert. Sarah grabbed Danny's arm and pulled him toward a cluster of large rocks about 200 yards away, the only cover visible in the flat landscape. As they ran, she explained that they needed to hide because she thought someone might be trying to hurt her. The kid was smart enough not to ask questions and fast enough to keep up. They dove behind the rocks just as the first truck came into view. Through a gap in the stone, Sarah watched 3 men in military fatigues climb out, carrying weapons that definitely weren't standard issue for any legitimate rescue operation. They moved with professional precision, spreading out to search the landing area while one man examined the parachute she'd been forced to abandon. The leader was speaking into a radio, his voice carrying across the desert air. Sarah caught fragments of his report about the target surviving and requesting instructions for next steps. Her blood ran cold when she heard him describe both her and Danny as loose ends that needed to be eliminated. Whatever she'd stumbled into, these people were willing to kill an innocent college student to keep it secret. Sarah's military training kicked in as she assessed their situation. They had no weapons, no communication devices, and no transportation. The nearest road was at least 5 miles away across open desert, and their pursuers had vehicles and professional equipment. But she also had advantages. She knew this area, from hundreds of training jumps, and she understood how to survive in harsh conditions. She whispered to Danny to stay perfectly still while she tried to figure out their next move. The searchers were being systematic, checking every possible hiding spot in an expanding circle around the landing site. It would only be minutes before they reached the rock formation. Sarah made a desperate decision that went against every survival instinct she had. Instead of trying to hide until dark, she decided they needed to move immediately, while the searchers were focused on the area near her abandoned parachute. She'd noticed a small wash, probably carved by flash floods, that ran roughly parallel to their position about 50 yards away. If they could reach it without being seen, it might provide a hidden route away from the immediate danger. She explained the plan to Danny in urgent whispers. They would crawl on their bellies across the open ground, using the scattered sagebrush for minimal cover. If they were spotted, they would run in different directions to split up the pursuit. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than waiting to be found. The crawl across open ground felt like it took hours, though it was probably only minutes. Every sound seemed amplified. Every movement felt exposed. Sarah's heart pounded as she heard the searchers getting closer, their boots crunching on the desert floor and their voices growing louder as they called out coordinates to each other. They made it to the wash just as one of the searchers crested the hill above their former hiding spot. Sarah pulled Danny down into the shallow depression, and they pressed themselves against the sandy bottom, hardly daring to breathe. The wash was only about 3 feet deep, barely enough to hide them if someone looked directly down from above. For 20 agonizing minutes, they listened to the search continue around them. Sarah heard the frustration growing in the men's voices as they failed to find any trace of their quarry. One of them was arguing with someone on the radio, insisting that the targets couldn't have gotten far on foot. The response was apparently not what he wanted to hear, because his curses turned the air blue. Eventually, the voices moved away as the searchers expanded their perimeter. Sarah waited another 10 minutes before risking a look over the edge of the wash. The trucks were still visible in the distance, but the men had moved their search much farther from their current position. This was their chance to put some real distance between themselves and their hunters. She led Danny along the wash, moving as quickly as they could while staying below ground level. The depression meandered roughly northeast, which would take them toward the highway eventually, but progress was slow and exhausting. The desert sun was climbing higher, and neither of them had water or protection from the heat. After an hour of difficult travel, they reached a point where the wash intersected with a larger arroyo. Sarah realized this was the same dry riverbed that ran past an abandoned mining camp she'd spotted from the air during previous jumps. If her memory was correct, there might be shelter and possibly even water at the old camp. The mining camp turned out to be more intact than she'd hoped. Several buildings still had roofs, and one of them contained an old hand-pumped well that actually produced brackish but drinkable water. They filled their bellies and rested in the shade, while Sarah tried to figure out their next move. Danny had been incredibly brave throughout their ordeal, but now that the immediate danger had passed, the questions started coming. Who were those men? Why were they trying to kill her? What had she done to make such dangerous enemies? Sarah realized she owed him at least a partial explanation if she expected his continued cooperation. She told him about her discoveries at the skydiving center, about the sabotaged equipment and forged documents. She explained that she'd been investigating what she thought was insurance fraud or negligence, but had apparently uncovered something much more serious. She didn't mention her suspicions about government involvement or illegal weapons testing, partly because she wasn't sure herself, and partly because Danny was already terrified enough. As afternoon wore on, Sarah noticed dust clouds on the horizon indicating that the search was continuing. Their pursuers had brought in additional vehicles and were conducting a grid search of the entire area. It was only a matter of time before they found the mining camp. Sarah and Danny needed to get to civilization and contact the authorities before that happened. But as she watched the systematic search pattern through the camp's broken windows, Sarah realized with growing dread that law enforcement might not be safe either. The men hunting them had military equipment and professional training. They'd been prepared to murder both her and Danny without hesitation. This wasn't the work of some local criminal organization. she was dealing with people who had significant resources and no regard for collateral damage. If they were willing to kill an innocent college student to protect their secret, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to eliminate any police officers or federal agents who got in their way. Sarah began to understand that she and Danny were completely on their own. As darkness fell over the Nevada desert, Sarah made the hardest decision of her life. She had to leave Danny behind at the mining camp while she infiltrated whatever operation was using the skydiving center as cover. The college student had been incredibly brave, but what she planned to do next required military training and a willingness to risk everything. She gave Danny the last of their water and detailed instructions on how to reach the highway once the search teams moved on. He was to wait until dawn, then follow the old mining road northeast for exactly 3 miles until he reached the state route. From there, he could flag down a passing vehicle and get help. But Danny surprised her by refusing to be left behind. Despite his fear, he insisted that they were in this together now. He'd seen the men who wanted to kill them, and he understood that Sarah was the only person standing between him and a very unpleasant death. If she was going back to face these people, he wanted to help, however he could. Sarah tried to explain that where she was going, untrained civilians would only be a liability, but Danny made a compelling argument. He was a computer science major who specialized in network security. If this conspiracy involved digital records, communications, or electronic surveillance, he might be more useful than she realized. Reluctantly, she agreed to let him come with her, knowing she could always order him to retreat if things got too dangerous. They waited until the search teams had moved their operation several miles east before beginning their journey back toward Desert Wind. Skydiving Center? Travel was slow and dangerous, requiring them to hide whenever vehicle headlights appeared on the desert roads. By the time they reached the facility's perimeter, it was nearly 3 in the morning. The skydiving center looked different in the pre-dawn darkness. Security lights that had never been there before illuminated the main building and hangar. 2 guards patrolled the fence line with military precision, and Sarah counted at least 4 vehicles that hadn't been part of the center's normal fleet. Whatever operation was based here, it was much larger than a simple skydiving school. From their hiding spot in the desert scrub, Sarah and Danny observed the facility for over an hour, documenting guard patterns and identifying potential entry points. The main hangar seemed to be the center of activity, with people and vehicles moving in and out throughout the night. Sarah noticed that some of the aircraft parked outside were not civilian planes but military transport helicopters with their markings painted over. Danny proved his value immediately by recognizing the electronic security system protecting the perimeter. He identified the sensor types and frequency patterns, explaining how they could be bypassed with the right approach. His knowledge of surveillance technology far exceeded what Sarah would have expected from a college student, but she was grateful for any advantage they could get. They decided to approach from the west side of the facility, where the desert provided cover almost to the fence line. Danny had identified a gap in the sensor coverage where maintenance equipment had disrupted the electronic barriers. It was a narrow window, but skilled infiltration was something Sarah's Special Forces background had prepared her for. The fence was standard chain link topped with razor wire, nothing that couldn't be overcome with patience and the right tools. Sarah used a pair of bolt cutters she'd found at the mining camp to create a small opening, just large enough for them to squeeze through. The real challenge was crossing the open ground between the fence and the hangar without being detected by the roving guards. They moved like shadows across the facility grounds, timing their advance to coincide with the guards' patrol patterns. Sarah's military training had included extensive work in stealth infiltration, but doing it with a civilian companion added complexity she'd never faced before. Danny did better than she'd expected, staying low and quiet while they covered the dangerous open spaces. The hangar's main doors were locked and alarmed, but Sarah had noticed that the building had several ventilation openings near the roofline. If they could reach one of those access points, they might be able to get inside without triggering the electronic security. The challenge was climbing 30 feet of vertical concrete wall without being spotted by the guards. Danny surprised her again by producing a small electronic device from his pocket that he claimed could temporarily disrupt the motion sensors covering the wall they needed to climb. He'd built it as part of a college project on security vulnerabilities, never imagining he'd use it in a real infiltration. Sarah was beginning to realize that her civilian companion had skills that complemented her own in unexpected ways. The climb was terrifying but successful. Sarah went first, finding handholds in the concrete blocks and steel framework, while Danny followed behind. The ventilation opening was just large enough for them to squeeze through, leading into a network of ductwork that ran throughout the building's upper levels. From inside the ventilation system, they could hear voices and machinery operating in the main hangar below. What they saw when they finally found a vent that opened into the hangar proper made Sarah's blood run cold. The space wasn't being used to store civilian aircraft or skydiving equipment. Instead, it contained sophisticated military hardware that had no business being at a private facility. Weapons crates, communication equipment, and what appeared to be prototype aircraft filled the enormous space. But most shocking of all was the sight of Marcus Webb, the man who'd given her a job and claimed to care about aviation safety, directing operations alongside people in military uniforms. He was coordinating what appeared to be a weapons transfer, signing documents and supervising the loading of unmarked crates into a transport helicopter. Sarah recognized some of the equipment from her military service, including advanced guidance, systems that were classified far above the level of anything a civilian should have access to. This wasn't just criminal activity or corporate fraud. This was espionage, illegal weapons trafficking, and quite possibly treason on a massive scale. Danny was recording everything with his phone, careful to keep the camera lens pressed against the vent opening to avoid reflecting light. His background in computer security had taught him to document everything, knowing that evidence would be crucial if they survived long enough to expose what they'd found. As they watched from their hiding place in the ventilation system, Sarah began to understand the full scope of what she'd accidentally discovered. Desert Wind Skydiving Center was a front operation for trafficking military technology to foreign buyers. Her investigation into equipment sabotage had threatened to expose the entire conspiracy, so they'd tried to eliminate her in what would look like a training accident. The conversation below confirmed her worst fears. Marcus was discussing timeline acceleration because of what he called the Martinez problem. They knew she'd been investigating them, and her survival of their sabotage attempt had forced them to move their operation ahead of schedule. The weapons transfer that was happening tonight was supposed to be their final transaction before abandoning the facility. But Sarah also learned something that chilled her to the bone. They weren't just worried about her exposing their criminal activities. According to Marcus, she'd seen something during one of her equipment inspections that could identify their buyers and reveal the true scope of their operation. They couldn't simply disappear and set up somewhere else because she possessed information that could bring down a network spanning multiple countries. As dawn approached, the activity in the hangar began to wind down. The transport helicopter was loaded and ready to depart, and most of the personnel were preparing to evacuate the facility. Sarah realized this was probably her only chance to gather enough evidence to expose the conspiracy, but it would mean taking enormous risks while the facility was still occupied. She whispered to Danny that they needed to split up. He would continue documenting everything from their position in the ventilation system, while she attempted to access the office areas where they likely kept computer records and communications logs. It went against every principle of military tactics to divide their forces, but they needed evidence that would survive even if she didn't make it out alive. Sarah dropped down from the ventilation system into Marcus Webb's private office, landing silently on the carpeted floor behind his desk. The space was exactly what she'd expected from the man she'd thought was just a successful businessman, with aviation awards on the walls and photos of him with various local officials. But now she saw everything differently, understanding that these relationships were probably part of his cover story. The computer on his desk was still logged in, apparently left active during the night's frantic preparations for evacuation. Sarah's hands flew over the keyboard as she accessed files that revealed the true scope of Desert Wind Skydiving Center's operations. What she found was worse than she'd imagined. The facility had been trafficking advanced military technology for over 3 years, with buyers including hostile foreign governments and international criminal organizations. The files contained detailed records of transactions, shipping manifests, and communication logs with buyers around the world. Sarah used a flash drive she'd found in the desk drawer to copy everything, knowing this evidence would be crucial if she survived long enough to get it to the proper authorities. But as she worked, she could hear voices and footsteps in the hallway outside the office. The evacuation was proceeding according to a well-rehearsed plan, with different teams responsible for destroying evidence, removing equipment, and eliminating witnesses. Sarah's stomach lurched when she found her own name on a target list, along with Danny's and several other people who'd apparently gotten too close to the truth over the years. She wasn't the first person who'd discovered their operation, just the first one who'd managed to survive the initial elimination attempt. A noise in the hallway made her freeze at the computer. Someone was approaching the office, probably Marcus coming to collect his personal files before the final evacuation. Sarah looked around desperately for a hiding place, but the office was too small and sparsely furnished to offer much concealment. She was going to have to fight her way out, something she'd hoped to avoid while gathering evidence. The door opened and Marcus Webb entered, followed by 2 armed men in tactical gear. Sarah recognized one of them as Tony Reeves, the equipment manager who'd been acting nervous around her for weeks. The other was a stranger with military bearing and cold eyes that suggested he'd killed before without hesitation. They weren't expecting to find anyone in the office, which gave Sarah a crucial few seconds of surprise. She came up from behind the desk with the heavy glass paperweight that had been Marcus's award for aviation safety, a bitter irony that wasn't, lost on her as she used it to crush his windpipe. The move was brutal but effective, dropping him instantly while she rolled toward the unknown gunman who was struggling to bring his weapon to bear in the confined space. Her military training took over completely as she fought for her life in Marcus's office. The close quarters worked in her favor, preventing the armed men from using their weapons effectively while allowing her to employ hand-to-hand combat techniques that had been drilled into her during Special Forces training. But she was outnumbered and couldn't maintain the advantage indefinitely. Tony Reeves was backing toward the door, apparently hoping to escape and call for reinforcements rather than engage in the fight directly. Sarah couldn't let him get away to alert the rest of the evacuation team. She grabbed the laptop computer and hurled it at his head, connecting with enough force to send him crashing into the door frame and buying her precious seconds to deal with the remaining threat. The professional gunman was recovering from her initial attack and bringing his pistol into position. Sarah had no choice but to close the distance before he could get a clean shot, tackling him around the waist and driving him backward through the office's large window. They crashed through the glass together, falling 8 feet to the ground. Outside the building in a shower of broken shards and twisted metal framing. The impact knocked the wind out of both of them, but Sarah recovered first. She grabbed the gunman's weapon and rolled away from him, coming up in a combat crouch just as footsteps and shouting voices indicated that their dramatic exit had attracted attention from the evacuation teams. She had maybe 30 seconds before. The entire facility would be converging on her position. The flash drive with the copied files was still in her pocket, but she needed to get it to Danny and then find a way to escape the facility before they were both caught. The hangar was on, the opposite side of the complex, which meant crossing open ground under hostile fire. But the alternative was certain death, either immediately or after they'd tortured information about what she'd discovered out of both of them. Sarah sprinted toward the hangar, using parked vehicles and equipment for cover as bullets began flying from multiple directions. The evacuation team had apparently been prepared for this contingency, with predetermined positions and fields of fire that turned the facility into a deadly maze. But Sarah's military experience had included urban combat training, and she knew how to move through hostile territory. She reached the hangar just as Danny was climbing down from the ventilation system, having heard the gunfire and realized their infiltration had been discovered. He'd managed to record additional evidence on his phone, including clear footage of Marcus Webb coordinating the weapons transfers. Between his recordings and her copied files, they had enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy if they could survive long enough to get it to authorities. The transport helicopter was spinning up for immediate departure, its rotors creating a windstorm that provided both cover and confusion. Sarah realized this might be their only chance to escape, but it would require them to somehow get aboard an aircraft full of hostile personnel who wanted them dead. It was an insane plan, but staying on the ground meant certain death as the evacuation. Teams closed in around them. She explained her desperate idea to Danny as they crouched behind a stack of equipment crates while bullets sparked off the metal around them. They would use the chaos and noise of the helicopter departure to approach the aircraft from its blind spot. If they could get aboard during the final moments before takeoff, they might be able to overpower the crew or at least survive long enough to crash the helicopter in a populated area where authorities would investigate. Danny's face went white when he understood what she was proposing, but he nodded agreement anyway. They'd come too far and risked too much to give up now. The evidence they'd gathered was worth dying for if it meant stopping an international weapons trafficking network that threatened national security. But Sarah was determined to get them both out alive, if humanly possible. The helicopter was beginning to lift off as they made their desperate dash across the open hangar floor. Hostile fire erupted from multiple positions, but the air crew couldn't shoot effectively without risking damage to their own aircraft. Sarah and Danny reached the helicopter's cargo door just as it cleared the ground, grabbing onto the landing gear and hauling themselves up into the aircraft as it gained altitude. What they found inside the helicopter's cargo compartment made their blood run cold. The aircraft wasn't just loaded with weapons and equipment, it also contained 3 large containers that were clearly designed to hold human prisoners. They'd discovered not just a weapons trafficking operation, but something much worse. Desert. Wind Skydiving Center had been part of an international network involved in human trafficking as well. Sarah realized with growing horror that some of the people on the target list she'd seen in Marcus's computer weren't just witnesses to be eliminated. They were potential victims to be sold to the highest bidder. Her discovery of the equipment sabotage had accidentally exposed a criminal empire that traded in both weapons and human lives on a global scale. As the helicopter climbed toward its cruising altitude, Sarah and Danny found themselves trapped aboard an aircraft with a crew of international criminals who would kill them without hesitation if they were discovered. But they also had evidence that could bring down an entire network of traffickers and save countless future victims. The question now was whether they could survive long enough to get that evidence to people who could act on it. The helicopter flew through the night sky at maximum speed, heading northwest toward what Sarah assumed was the final delivery point for the weapons and whatever human cargo they'd been transporting. She and Danny remained hidden in the cargo compartment, wedged between equipment crates and trying to stay invisible while the flight crew focused on navigation and communication with their destination. From fragments of conversation she could overhear through the aircraft's intercom system, Sarah learned they were heading for a remote airstrip in Oregon where another transport would take the cargo to its final overseas destination. The timeline had been accelerated because of what the crew kept referring to as the security breach, meaning her and Danny's infiltration of the facility. Danny was monitoring the radio communications using skills he'd learned in his computer science program, managing to decode some of the encrypted transmissions between the helicopter and ground control. What he discovered made their situation even more desperate. The entire network was being shut down immediately, with all evidence destroyed and all potential witnesses eliminated. They weren't just trying to escape anymore, They were racing against a systematic cover-up that would erase any trace of the conspiracy. The flight took them over increasingly remote terrain as they traveled north through Nevada and into Oregon. Sarah used her knowledge of aviation to estimate their speed and heading, calculating that they had maybe 2 hours before reaching their destination. 2 hours to figure out how to overpower a professional air crew, take control of a military helicopter, and somehow get their evidence to authorities who could act on it before the entire network vanished. But their situation got worse when they overheard a radio conversation that chilled them both to the bone. The destination airstrip was equipped with a crematorium that had been used to dispose of witnesses and failed business partners. Sarah and Danny weren't going to be killed quickly. They were going to be tortured for information about what they'd discovered and who else might know about it, then eliminated in a way that would leave no physical evidence. The helicopter began its descent toward what appeared to be a completely dark landscape. But as they got closer, Sarah could see the faint outline of a landing strip and several buildings that had been carefully hidden from aerial observation. This wasn't just a transfer point. It was a major operations center for the entire trafficking network. Vehicle headlights appeared on the ground as the helicopter approached for landing. Sarah counted at least 6 trucks and several cars, suggesting a significant number of personnel waiting for them. She and Danny were going to be vastly outnumbered from the moment they touched down, with nowhere to run in the remote Oregon wilderness. The aircraft settled onto the landing pad with professional precision, its rotors winding down as ground crews approached to begin unloading operations. Sarah knew they had only minutes before the cargo compartment would be opened and their hiding spot discovered. This was their last chance to take action while the crew was focused on landing procedures and shutting down aircraft systems. She signaled Danny to stay hidden while she moved toward the flight compartment, where the pilot and co-pilot were completing their post-flight checklists. Her plan was simple and desperate: rely on surprise and her military training to overpower both crew members before they could raise an alarm. It was a long shot, but the alternative was certain death. Sarah's attack was swift and silent. She disabled the co-pilot with a sleeper hold that cut off blood flow to his brain, rendering him unconscious in seconds without permanent damage. The pilot reached for his sidearm, but Sarah was faster, using a nerve strike that paralyzed his arm while she grabbed his weapon. Within 30 seconds, she had control of the flight deck, but her victory was short-lived. The ground crews had noticed that the helicopter's crew wasn't responding to radio calls and were approaching the aircraft to investigate. Sarah could see armed men moving toward the helicopter from multiple directions, their weapons ready and their movements coordinated like a military unit. She quickly called Danny forward and explained their new desperate plan. They were going to steal the helicopter and attempt to fly it back toward civilization where they could contact law enforcement. Neither of them had helicopter pilot training, but Sarah's military background included some experience with aircraft systems, and Danny's technical knowledge might help them figure out the controls. The helicopter's engines were still warm from the flight, which meant they could potentially get it airborne again without the lengthy startup procedures that would give their enemies time to stop them. But they would have to take off while under hostile fire, navigate unfamiliar terrain in darkness, and somehow land safely, despite having no formal training on this type of aircraft. Sarah strapped herself into the pilot's seat while Danny took the co-pilot position, both of them frantically studying the control layouts and trying to remember everything they'd ever learned about helicopter operations. The ground crews were shouting outside and beginning to surround the aircraft, their weapons trained on the flight deck windows. The engine startup sequence took precious seconds that they didn't have. Sarah's hands flew over switches and controls, following her best guess about the proper procedures while bullets began impacting the helicopter's armored sides. The aircraft wasn't designed for combat, but it had been reinforced enough to withstand small arms fire for a limited time. Danny proved invaluable during the startup, his technical background allowing him to interpret the instrument displays and warning lights more quickly than Sarah could have managed alone. Together, they got the helicopter's engines spooled up and the rotor system engaged just as the hostile ground fire was beginning to find vulnerable spots in the aircraft's protection. The takeoff was terrifying and chaotic, with Sarah pulling maximum power while trying to avoid the worst of the ground fire. The helicopter lurched into the air in an uncontrolled climb that nearly ended in a crash before she managed to get the aircraft stabilized and flying in something resembling normal flight. But they were still over hostile territory with limited fuel and no clear destination. Navigation became their next challenge as Sarah tried to fly the stolen helicopter toward the nearest population center where they could land and contact authorities. Danny used his phone's GPS to provide basic. The hospital parking lot erupted in chaos as emergency responders, police officers, and federal agents converged on the stolen helicopter. Sarah and Danny found themselves at the center of a jurisdictional nightmare as multiple agencies claimed authority over their case. But the evidence they'd gathered was so explosive that within hours, the investigation had been elevated to the highest levels of national security. Danny's recordings and Sarah's copied files painted a picture of corruption that reached into multiple government agencies and international organizations. The Desert Wind skydiving center had been just one node in a network that spanned 3 continents, trafficking weapons, technology, and human beings with the protection of corrupt officials at every level. The FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force took custody of Sarah and Danny, initially treating them as suspects rather than witnesses. But as agents reviewed the evidence they'd gathered, the investigation quickly shifted focus toward the massive conspiracy they'd uncovered. Special Agent Maria Santos, a veteran investigator with experience in international trafficking cases, became their primary handler and protector. Agent Santos explained that the evidence would need to be verified and corroborated before arrests could be made, a process that could take months, while Sarah and Danny remained in protective custody. But the trafficking network wasn't going to wait for the legal system to move at its normal pace. Within 48 hours of their arrival at the hospital, there had been 3 attempts to eliminate them despite FBI protection. The scope of the conspiracy became clearer as investigators followed the trails revealed in the stolen files. Marcus Webb had been a mid-level operative in an organization that included corrupt military officers, defense contractors, and foreign intelligence agents. The weapons they'd been trafficking included prototypes of advanced guidance systems that could have shifted the balance of power in multiple regional conflicts. But the human trafficking component was even more disturbing. The network had been kidnapping military personnel, defense contractors, and their families to sell information and leverage against government officials. Some of the missing persons cases that had puzzled law enforcement for years were actually victims of this systematic program of extortion and control. Sarah learned that her investigation into equipment sabotage had threatened the network's security in ways she'd never imagined. The forged signatures and compromised equipment weren't just covering up accidents. They were part of a testing program for assassination techniques that could eliminate targets while making their deaths appear accidental. She'd been studying a laboratory for murder disguised as a skydiving school. The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything in American legal history. The evidence Sarah and Danny had gathered led to arrests in 17 countries and exposed corruption networks that had operated undetected for over a decade. But the process of bringing everyone to justice took nearly 3 years, during which both witnesses remained under federal protection. Danny used his computer skills to help federal investigators trace the digital components of the conspiracy, becoming an expert witness in cases involving cybercrime and electronic surveillance. His testimony was crucial in convicting several high-level defendants who thought their encrypted communications and offshore servers would protect them from prosecution. Sarah found herself working closely with military intelligence agencies, helping them understand how the trafficking network had penetrated defense contractors and government facilities. Her knowledge of both military procedures and civilian aviation made her uniquely qualified to assist in closing the security gaps that had allowed the conspiracy to operate. The trials revealed that Desert Wind Skydiving Center had been chosen. as a front operation specifically because it provided legitimate reasons for aircraft movement, weapons storage, and international communications. The remote Nevada location had allowed large-scale operations to continue without attracting attention from local law enforcement or federal agencies. Tony Reeves, the equipment manager who'd been acting nervous around Sarah, turned out to be an undercover federal agent who'd been investigating the network for 2 years. His apparent betrayal had actually been an attempt to protect her by delaying the sabotage of her equipment, giving her time to discover the evidence that ultimately brought down the entire operation. The international implications of the case led to diplomatic crises with several allied nations whose officials had been compromised by the trafficking network. New protocols for background investigations and security clearances were implemented across multiple government agencies, fundamentally changing how national security information was protected. Marcus Webb died in federal custody before his trial. Could be completed, officially from a heart attack, but under circumstances that suggested the network's reach extended even into maximum security prisons. His death eliminated a key witness, but also demonstrated the lengths to which the remaining conspirators would go to protect their secrets. Sarah and Danny's partnership had saved countless lives and prevented advanced military technology from reaching hostile nations and terrorist organizations, but the personal cost was enormous. Both of them had to abandon their previous identities and start new lives under federal witness protection, never able to return to the people and places they'd known before their accidental discovery of the conspiracy. 5 years later, Sarah works as a flight instructor at a small airport in Montana under an assumed name, still teaching people to fly but never forgetting the night she stole a helicopter and helped bring down an international trafficking network. Danny graduated with a computer science degree and now works for a federal cybersecurity agency, using his skills to hunt down criminal networks that operate in the digital shadows. They maintain contact through secure channels, bound together by their shared experience and the knowledge that their courage in the face of overwhelming odds had made the world safer. The trafficking network they exposed had been completely dismantled, its leaders imprisoned or dead, and its victims finally free to rebuild their lives. But both Sarah and Danny know that other networks exist, operating in the shadows and exploiting the same vulnerabilities that allowed Desert Wind Skydiving Center to hide in plain sight. Their victory was complete but temporary, a single battle won in an ongoing war between those who would exploit the innocent and those brave enough to stand against them. The case became a classified study in how ordinary citizens could accidentally uncover extraordinary crimes and how courage and determination could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies. Sarah's decision to trust her instincts about sabotaged equipment had prevented countless deaths and exposed a threat to national security that might have operated undetected for years longer. In the end, what started as a routine skydiving lesson had become one of the most significant counterintelligence victories in recent history, proving that sometimes the most dangerous enemies hide behind the most innocent facades, and that heroes can emerge from the most unexpected circumstances.